Every few years, the same thing happens. Markets crash, banks wobble, politicians rush to cameras and say the system almost collapsed, but didn't, because they saved it. And yet, every time this happens, ordinary people come out poorer, and the same small group comes out richer. Stocks recover, asset prices explode, the bonuses return. If the system almost died, why did the people who ran it get rewarded? If these are accidents, why do they all point in the same direction? Here's the uncomfortable answer. Modern finance is not designed to avoid crises. It is designed to use crises. Over the last century and a half, four men, four architects of modern central banking and Wall Street, helped build a machine where every shock becomes an opportunity to transfer wealth upward, where losses are socialized, gains are privatized, and where you can never truly step outside the game. This isn't conspiracy. The speeches are public. The laws are on record. The bailouts were televised. Once you see how the crisis machine was built, you will stop seeing crashes as mistakes and start seeing them as fuel. For most of history, finance was brutally simple. If a bank made bad loans and couldn't pay depositors, it failed. Shareholders were wiped out, rich families lost fortunes, towns suffered. And then, slowly, a new bank would appear and try again. It was painful, it was chaotic, but it had one key feature. Risk stayed with the people who took it. If you lent foolishly, you lived with the consequences. There was no giant safety net ready to catch you. Then industrial capitalism arrived. Railroads, factories, global trade. Suddenly, the failure of one big institution didn't just hurt one town, it threatened entire national economies. Elites faced a choice: accept that sometimes large, important players must go bankrupt, or invent a new rule. The system is too important to fail, and therefore, so are the people who run it. That rule didn't appear overnight. It was built crisis by crisis, decision by decision, by four men who solved each emergency in a way that permanently shifted risk off the powerful and onto everyone else. The first architect never ran a central bank. Walter Bagehot was a 19th century journalist and thinker who watched the Bank of England survive repeated panics. In the 1800s, Britain's financial system kept catching fire. Speculators would bid up railway stocks or colonial schemes. When the bubble burst, banks would suddenly face runs, crowds demanding gold they didn't have. Each time, the Bank of England had a terrifying choice: let the fire burn and allow overextended banks to go under, or pour money onto the flames and risk inflating the next bubble. Bagehot watched this and wrote down a simple doctrine that became gospel. In a crisis, the central bank must lend freely at a high rate against good collateral. On the surface, this sounds responsible. Don't rescue insolvent gamblers. Just provide liquidity to sound institutions temporarily short on cash. But in practice, it did something subtle and profound. It told big banks, if you are important enough to cause a panic, the central bank will be there. You may suffer, but you will not be allowed to vanish. That one idea, the lender of last resort, turned the central bank from a passive institution into the fire brigade of capitalism. From that point on, the question in every crisis wasn't who deserves to fail. It was who is too critical to allow failure at all. Once that line exists, powerful players make sure they stand on the critical side of it. Bagehot died in 1877. He never saw modern derivatives, megabanks, or trillion-dollar bailouts. But his doctrine laid the first brick: the assumption that when the right sort of people are in danger, the state must step in. Risk hadn't disappeared. It had just started to move, away from the biggest balance sheets and toward the public. Fast forward to 1907. America still doesn't have a formal central bank. Its financial system is a tangle of lightly regulated trusts and banks. Then the panic hits. A failed speculation triggers a run on New York trust companies. Stock prices plunge. Credit locks up. The entire system starts to freeze. There is no Federal Reserve, no deposit insurance. There is, however, one man powerful enough to act like both: John Pierpont Morgan. 70 years old, ruthless and feared, Morgan summons the leading bankers of New York to his library. He locks the doors, literally. He forces competing bankers to open their books, shames them into admitting who is solvent and who is rotten, and bullies them into pooling money to rescue the institutions he deems systemically important. It works. The panic stops. Morgan is hailed as the man who saved American finance. But look closely at what actually happened. No democratic process chose which firms lived and which died. No public debate set the terms of rescue. One private financier decided in secret who was worth saving and on what conditions. He proved two things at once. First, the system could not survive without some kind of central backstop. Second, the people rich enough to provide that backstop gained enormous power over everyone else. The Panic of 1907 became the argument for creating an official central bank, the Federal Reserve, so that next time, the rescuer would be institutional, not personal. But the structure that emerged in 1913 was heavily shaped by the very bankers it was supposed to regulate. The lesson of Morgan's panic was simple. If you are big and interconnected enough, you will be rescued. The question is only, who controls the hose? The crisis machine now had a second gear. In normal times, banks enjoyed profits from speculative growth. In panics, they could demand collective support or threaten systemic collapse. Heads they win, tails they drag everyone into the fire with them. By the late 20th century, the financial world had become far more complex. Derivatives, leveraged buyouts, index funds, global capital flows, a web orders of magnitude larger than anything Bagehot or Morgan could imagine. In 1987, that web snapped. On October 19th, US stock markets crashed over 20% in a single day. No major war, no new depression, just a sudden, brutal reevaluation of risk. A new Federal Reserve chairman had taken office just 2 months earlier, Alan Greenspan. He had a choice: let markets clear, even if it meant a deep recession and mass losses for speculators, or signal that the Fed would not allow asset prices to fall too far, too fast. Greenspan chose the second path. He flooded the system with liquidity. He reassured Wall Street that the central bank stood ready to support the economic and financial system. Traders heard something else. If markets fall too hard, the Fed will catch them. This became known as the Greenspan Put, like an insurance policy under the market. If you bet aggressively on rising prices and things went wrong, the central bank would cut rates and pump liquidity until balance sheets recovered. From that moment, every trader and CEO quietly updated their models. Upside remained private. Bonuses, stock options, rising valuations. Downside was increasingly socialized. Rate cuts, emergency lending, implicit guarantees. The 1990s tech boom, the explosion of derivatives, the growth of hedge funds, all of it unfolded on top of this new assumption. There is always a buyer of last resort. There is always an exit. Greenspan didn't give bankers official immunity. He did something more powerful. He trained an entire generation to believe that whenever their bets threatened the system, the state would move the goalposts. Crises stopped being purely destructive. They became negotiations. How big does the fire have to be before you bail us out again? Then came 2008, decades of deregulation, mortgage fraud, and leveraged financial engineering finally converged into one colossal implosion. Major banks were effectively insolvent. The housing market was collapsing. The global financial system was hours away from seizing completely. This time, the man in the hot seat was Ben Bernanke, a scholar of the Great Depression who had spent his academic career asking one question: what should central banks do to keep a banking crisis from turning into a depression? In 2008, he answered it with unprecedented force. Interest rates were slashed to near zero. Trillions in emergency lending programs were created. For the first time, the Federal Reserve bought not just government bonds, but mortgage securities. Major institutions were merged or rescued under government pressure. It didn't stop there. In the years that followed, central banks in the US, Europe, Japan, and beyond embraced a new tool: quantitative easing, creating money to buy vast quantities of financial assets. The official justification was to stabilize the economy, restore lending, and avoid deflation. But look at who benefited most. Asset prices recovered, then soared. Stock markets reached all-time highs. Real estate rebounded. Corporate debt exploded at artificially low interest rates. If you owned financial assets, the rescue felt like a miracle. If you lived on wages and savings, it felt like running on a treadmill that someone kept speeding up. The logic of the crisis machine was now complete. In good times, cheap money encourages leverage, speculation, and risk-taking. When the inevitable crash arrives, central banks respond with even cheaper money and even larger interventions. Each rescue makes the financial system larger, more complex, and more dependent on the next rescue. The extraordinary programs of 2008 were supposed to be temporary. Instead, they became the blueprint. In 2020, faced with a pandemic shock, central banks didn't improvise. They simply scaled the same playbook: cut rates to zero, print trillions, buy everything in sight. Markets recovered in record time. Billionaires' wealth spiked. House prices decoupled from incomes even more. Crises were no longer just accidents. They were inputs into a machine designed to produce a specific output: asset inflation at the top, managed instability for everyone else. Put the four architects together and a pattern appears. Bagehot established the principle: in a panic, big institutions must be saved. Morgan showed how private power could use that principle to decide who lives and who dies. Greenspan turned it into an expectation: whenever markets fall too far, the central bank will step in. Bernanke scaled it into a permanent regime. Crises are met with such overwhelming support that the system grows more fragile but more rewarding for those closest to the fire hose. The result is a world where banks can lever up, knowing they are systemically important. Corporations can gorge on cheap debt to buy back their own shares. Asset managers can ride each bubble, confident that the next bailout will arrive in time. And you live in the part of the machine that absorbs the shock, through lost jobs in the recessions that follow each crash, through housing prices that rise faster than wages, through pensions and savings forced into riskier assets just to keep up, through currency debasement that quietly taxes every paycheck. The official story is always the same. This was an unprecedented crisis. We had no choice. We had to save the system. The unspoken truth is simpler. The system is the crisis. It needs periodic panics the way a forest needs controlled burns. Except the trees that burn are never the ones that planted the match. So why not just step away? Why not hold cash, avoid markets, ignore the machine? Because the same mechanism that rescues asset prices also punishes anyone who refuses to play. When central banks push interest rates to zero and keep them there, safe savings die. When they inflate asset prices, rent, tuition, and healthcare ride the same wave. Doing nothing is a bet. And in this system, it's often the worst one you can make. You are plugged into the crisis machine, whether you like it or not. Your job depends on companies whose financing costs rise and fall with policy decisions. Your currency's purchasing power depends on the next round of rescue. Your retirement depends on markets that no longer behave like markets, but like utilities managed for stability at the top. Four men, four turning points. Turn crises from cleansing fires into reasons for rescue. Turn rescues from rare exceptions into permanent expectations. Turn expectations into a doctrine. Markets must never be allowed to fully clear. Each decision made sense in the moment. Each was sold as necessary to avoid a deeper depression. Together, they produce something no one voted for: a system where risk is privatized on the way up and socialized on the way down. A system where crises are not bugs, but features. A system you cannot escape, only understand. The goal is not to offer a simple solution. There isn't one. You cannot unwind a century of decisions without breaking the very structure those decisions built. But you can refuse to be confused. You can stop treating every crash as a surprise, every bailout as an act of mercy, every emergency measure as temporary. Because once you see the machine, you stop asking, why do they keep making these mistakes? And start asking, if this is a mistake, why does it always benefit the same people? If this changed how you see financial crises, if panics, bailouts, and emergency rate cuts now look less like random storms and more like scheduled maintenance on a very profitable engine, subscribe. In the next videos, we'll break down how this crisis machine touches your savings, your job, and your country's future, and what, if anything, can still be done from inside a system that was never designed to let you out.